Hello, is this on? Okay. Whew. Got to catch my breath a second. I just ran here all the way from a little village called Edmonton. Just trying to get out. You got to hear about this Jesus guy. I mean, so listen. So we were all listening to the rabbi teach, and then we realized it was getting dark. So he told us to head out into the water. And so he told us to go in the water. We grab a few boats. We get out. All of a sudden, when we're in the midst of the water, there's a violent, sudden attack of wind. The waves are coming over. Our boats are starting to fill up with water. We cannot scoop the water out of the boats fast enough. And here's the rabbi just sleeping peacefully through the whole thing. I can't even see the people in the next boat because the wind is so strong. The water's getting in my face. Our boat is half full of water. He is sleeping peacefully. So I go over and I'm like, wake up, do something. Help us throw some water out of this boat or we're going to drown. And he gets up and he speaks and the wind and the waves stop. And we are awestruck. I mean, who is this guy who can speak and the very elements themselves will obey him? I mean, look, if you haven't gotten it by now, our rabbi is from heaven itself and is no mere man. If that wasn't enough proof, once we got to the other side, we were met by Reuben the possessed. The accursed man seemed to know our teacher. And he called him by name, and he called him the Son of the Most High God. It was a voice that was unnatural, and we shuddered in fear, but our rabbi was unperturbed. He even further had mercy on the demons that possessed Reuben. He sent them into the filthy pigs, and they drowned themselves. Good riddance. But now, surely you've heard, Reuben the possessed has been going around himself, telling everybody he was healed. You must have heard about this. All these things that have occurred, the time of the Messiah is here.
Thank you, Zach. Zach has an incredible gift of really getting into the character of people in the story. So I wanted him to share this to give us a little perspective. It's called a holy imagination, and Zach got a very healthy dose of it. We're going to continue. We're actually going to go back to the text now after Zach primed us, and he's given you a perspective to bring as we go through this. It's going to be on the screen behind, and I'll make some comments as we're going through. Okay. So that day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him, and a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Now, growing up, we would always go out to the shoe swap for our summers, and we spent a lot of time on the lake. And I can speak as a non-seasoned boatsman that when the waves get high and start crashing into your boat, you're generally okay as long as you point your boat into the waves, and then you kind of slice through it like a knife through butter. It gets problematic, though, when there's a crosswind. And so when winds are coming from two different directions, and your boat, you can't cut into the waves because they're rolling this way and then perpendicularly coming at you. And these fishermen, seasoned salesmen, knew what they were doing, and they were terrified for their lives. This should give us a little step up on the intensity of the storm. And what was Jesus doing? Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. If you've been in a storm on a lake, you know you don't sleep through them. Your boat is going up, crashing down. You actually experience a moment of zero gravity, and you don't have to pay for this. It's zero gravity where your boat drops beneath you and you're still suspended from the last wave. You don't sleep through that. In fact, your body has a built-in instinct to wake you up when you're falling. It's generally why when you fall out of bed, you should wake up. So how was Jesus sleeping? This isn't the only story of somebody sleeping through a storm on a boat. And a lot of the time the Bible, especially in the New Testament, will make these allusions back to the Old. And so does anybody know where this other story is? Quick, shout it out if you think you know. I heard it. Jonah. Jonah 1. It's actually eerily similar to this story. So much so that you'd think it was on purpose. And I think it was. Those of you who don't know, Jonah was a prophet. It means one day God came to him and said, I want you to bring a message to someone, to this people. And he was a prophet who was sent to Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, who was the world power at the time. They were the America of the ancient Near East. And Jonah was terrified. Jonah knew what happened to prophets who walked into Nineveh. Jonah knew what happened when you challenged the powers that be. And so Jonah jumped in a boat and went as far away as possible. He went to Tarshish instead of Nineveh. That would be like us trying to go to Toronto and instead we end up in Canberra, Australia. The total opposite side of the world. But while Jonah was going, he got on a boat and a storm developed, just like this one, quickly. The sailors were so terrified for their lives that they started throwing cargo overboard. Very similar to what the disciples would have been doing here. And where was Jonah? Jonah was asleep in the hold of the ship. This deep sleep is a theme in the Bible. Adam was in a deep sleep when God took from his side and created Eve. Abraham was in a deep sleep when he had a vision of God making a covenant with him and his descendants. Deep sleeps in the Bible are usually an indication that something is going on and it relates to the overall mission of God. Let's go back to the disciples. The disciples woke him and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." In Jonah's story, the shipmates, after tossing their cargo overboard, came down, woke him up, and said, "How can you sleep through this storm? Get up and beg your God, and maybe he will save us." The cast lots was just a fancy way of rolling dice. And the dice said that Jonah was the culprit. And so they asked him, "Who are you? Why is this happening to us?" And Jonah said, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the one true God who made the land and the sea. And he's mad at me because I'm running from him." He said, "Throw me overboard and this storm will stop. It'll cease." And they didn't want to take on the guilt of murdering somebody at sea by throwing them overboard and leaving him to drown. So they started rowing back, tried to get back to the port on their own. And the storm just got more and more intense. And so finally they said, they washed their hands of it. They said, "God, we are not guilty for this man." And they tossed him overboard. And then we know the rest of the story. Jonah was swallowed by a fish. Very, very similar stories. Now, why? Why the similarity? They don't seem to have the same meaning. Jesus wasn't running from God when he was crossing the lake to go to the other side. Storytellers use something called illusion. I married a marketer, and so I've learned all these little marketing tricks. So you know that there's a color psychology when it comes to shopping. So when you go to the mall, things are color-coded in order to influence you, to prime your mind, so that you will behave a certain way. Red tag sales. You've heard of those? If you're like me, you love red tag sales because you can get a bargain. Peter loves them too, I bet. They use the color red because it creates a sense of urgency in us. It's probably related to us seeing blood, and thinking, I have to do something about this. But marketers use the color red to make us act impulsively and instinctively towards what they want with a sense of urgency. This is color psychologists priming. Now, storytellers don't have colors, so they can't manipulate us in that way. Instead, they use illusion. So they'll say something that sounds very similar to something you might know, hoping that you'll make the connection and draw from those themes. If I were to start a story with a long, long time ago, immediately you're primed to think of Star Wars and the new movie that's coming out in December. This is how storytellers can bring people along into their story. Mark alludes back to the story of Jonah to tell us this is about missions. And I didn't realize this until I started to look into this deeper. This story is really about the mission of God and our participation in it. We're going to read this next story. I want you to have that lens, the mission of God, and how our story relates to it. This is when they get to the other side. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs. Allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and the countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man, and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And all the people were amazed. And in doing so, this man became the first missionary to the Gentiles. The first one to go out and lay the groundwork for what God was doing and what was coming. Now, he didn't have the whole gospel. He didn't know Jesus and the cross and everything that would come there. But he went out, shared his story, and prepared them for what was coming next. And I tell you, this is what the world needs more of. People who have an encounter with Jesus and then go and tell us about it. This man didn't get a theology degree. This man didn't get evangelism training. All he had was his encounter with God. The way that God totally, completely transformed his life. And he went out and shared that. This is story-based evangelism. And this is the kind of evangelism that we need in our world today. It's because our world is changing. And I was listening to a sermon from a pastor named Timothy Keller this week. He was talking about America, but the same concepts apply to Canada. In fact, even more so. But we are a post-Christian nation. So that means at one point we were a Christian nation, now we're post-Christian. It means we used to have a lot of Christian influence. And you see this with our school holidays being around Christmas and Easter, the two major Christian holidays. You see this where people swear on a Bible. My brother became an RCMP officer, and he had to take an oath on a Bible before he could be sworn in. Now, other people of different faiths were allowed to use their religious book as well. But still, the standard was the Bible. Back in that Christian nation, people already had a general understanding of the gospel. They knew who God was. They knew who Jesus was. They probably grew up going to church and then at some point decided it wasn't for them. But that meant that evangelism was more about reminding people of what they already knew instead of telling them something new. That is not the case anymore. Keller goes on to say that our culture, Canada, is inoculated against Christianity. Inoculated against Christianity. When I was a kid, my nurse mother thought the best approach to keeping me safe from chickenpox was to get the kid with chickenpox to come over and play with me. And she made sure that we shared a cookie. I don't know if chickenpox can transfer through cookies, but somehow I got chickenpox from that kid. And I had to go through the scratching and just all the terrible symptoms that followed. This, I really hope, was before we had a vaccine, or else I suffered needlessly. Debbie's telling me it wasn't. But I was then inoculated against chickenpox. I developed an immunity to it. I could still get it. I can probably still get it today. But it won't be as severe, and it's also a lot harder. Some of you have got your flu vaccine. It does the same thing. So our culture is inoculated against Christianity. It's come. People have tried it. Like an old jacket, it just doesn't fit anymore. And they don't want to put it back on. This is what we're up against when it comes to evangelism, to sharing our faith and to inviting other people into the kingdom of God. He goes even more in depth and says, we have a few problems that we're facing. A truth problem. Nobody wants to hear that there is a truth anymore. The idea of objective truth and that my truth is something you need to understand, that's gone. He says there's a guilt problem. And the fact is, people don't understand guilt. And instead of thinking we are guilty before God, somebody that we have to account for our actions before, we now just think guilt is an emotion that we need to do away with. And he also says there's a meaning problem. Nobody really thinks the Bible has authority in their lives anymore. So for us to come and share, the Bible says you're a sinner and you need to be saved. Nobody wants to hear that. They are inoculated against it. It just isn't going to work. They're not inoculated against your stories. In our postmodern world, truth is gone, experts are gone. What really matters is personal experience. And all of us have personal experience with God. It might not be as dramatic as having 2,000 plus demons cast out of us. It might not be that God miraculously stopped a storm while we're on the boat. Some of us may have encountered supernatural miracles or events in the past, but all of us have encountered Jesus in some way. That's why you didn't sleep in on a Sunday morning. That's why you came here. That's why you're part of our church. So I know we all have. And people are actually open to hearing about it. 90% of Canadians would say they are spiritual in some way. A very small percentage of that still wants to be a part of organized religion. But people are open to the idea that there is a God, that there is something that we can't see. And they are ready to hear your story. So that's what I want to talk about the rest of today, is sharing your story. This is my little paradigm I made to help you work on prepping a story, sharing your story, and doing some story-based evangelism in the people that you have around you. So let me go through it. Scribble your story. This is the best S word I could find. Write down your story. Take some time with God in a moment of reflection. Invite the Holy Spirit and reflect on what God has done in your life. Where has he worked? What has he saved you from? This man who was possessed with demons was saved from a life of ostracization. He was saved from self-inflicted wounds. He was saved from this deep pit of depression. But what have you been saved from? Maybe you have a mental health story. Maybe God has walked alongside you in your struggle with some health aspect. Be specific to you. Yes, God has saved you from sin. He has, and that's an important part of our story. But what specifically has God done in your life? God saved me from sexual temptation by answering prayers and giving me a community of accountability. God has saved me from financial distress by constantly providing work for me just when I needed it. Not before, not after. God has provided for me in so many ways. And I don't know why, but it's hard to think of it in the moment when we need it. But that's why a moment of prayerful reflection will bring these stories up and allow us to actually share them. How are you different from before you met Christ to after? Some of us grew up in the church, so we don't have a definitive moment where we became a Christian, and that's okay, because you still have a transition throughout your life. You still were this person, and now you're this one. That's part of your story. Has God spoken to you before? Maybe audibly, maybe just through an impression, maybe it was something in the Bible that really worked or really fit whatever was going on in your life. All of this is part of your story. I remember working for Superstore when I was in college, and I was bent over a bunker arranging some frozen chicken, and somebody just came up behind me, tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, "Hey, God wants me to tell you that this decision you're dealing with, that you're working through, isn't an A or B. You actually can choose. There's no right answer." And skeptic in me was like, thanks for the horoscope words. But the truth is, I was really working through a decision, whether or not to continue on in my college or take a break and like a gap year to work or do something else. And his words were comforting in the moment. So regardless of whether or not God downloaded something for him to say to me, God used his words to bring me comfort. This is all part of my story. We can easily miss what God's doing because we're looking for the dramatic. We're looking for the undeniable. We want to use our stories as an apologetic, meaning we want to be able to prove God's existence with our stories, instead of just say, this is what God's doing, and let it be a witness in itself. You have encounters with God. You have a story to share. After you found your story, the next step, and this is going to sound crazy, go tell other people. Go tell others about what God has done. This is significant that Jesus told this man not to follow him. He says, don't get in the boat and come back with me. You go back to your own people and tell them about the mercy and the work that the Lord has done in you. This is a lot easier than trying to do a gospel presentation to somebody. I don't know if you have tried a gospel tract, but there's something unnatural about sharing that kind of information, but it's completely natural to tell a story about yourself. Unfortunately, when it comes to God, for some reason we've decided we need to be shameful or we need to be kind of hide our God side. And we learn this. This isn't natural. I remember when I first became a Christian, I was so excited. I was ready to tell everybody what was going on. And then slowly along the line I learned, I'm supposed to keep this inside. I can rave about my Netflix shows that I love watching, but when it comes to the God that I've committed my life to, I need to keep that in. That is a disconnect that we all are experiencing. And really, we just need to say, no, thank you. Go and tell your story. Like I said, most people will be receptive to hearing your story. They're not going to want to hear about the doctrine of your faith, but they will want to hear why you believe, or what has God done, or what do you think God is doing. And as you're doing this, it is a perfect gateway to offer prayer. I want to say, I'm pulling this stat out of nowhere, but I think probably 90% of miracles that occur in the Bible are done in an evangelistic context. When you look back in the Old Testament, it's true. If you think about the plagues of Egypt, those were all done to prove who God is. If you think about Elijah, he throws a piece of a metal axe into the river and it floats. This was to prove who God is. In the New Testament, in the Gospels, in the book of Acts, everything, it's evangelistic. It's to prove who God is. So as we see this, it seems clear that God is more willing to do these crazy supernatural feats when it's an evangelistic moment, when somebody who doesn't know him is open to it. And so I think this is when we should offer prayer for people the most. When we've just shared, God has done this for me, and we've been open, we've been vulnerable with them, there's a trust that has been developed. And then we can extend that out and say, can I pray for you? This is very different than just going up to somebody on the street and asking if we can pray for them. That at times can be very off-putting. That at times can be almost offensive to somebody to say, well, you think there's something wrong with me, so you should pray for me? But if we've just shared a vulnerable part of our lives, it's just natural then to extend that back out to others. And when you do this, I think you should be persistent. I don't think it should be a one-off prayer. I think you should write this prayer down and pray for it until something happens. This is the model of prayer that we're given in scriptures. Be persistent. Pray. And the reason is, if you write it down, you don't forget about it. So when God does do something, you'll see it. We get discouraged in prayer so easily because we forget what we're praying about. And God can answer it, but we won't even notice. And so as you're sharing your story, offer to pray for others and watch what God does. Always do it in relationship. This is not a tactic for walking down the street or going to the train station, sitting down on the bus beside somebody, and saying, let me tell you what God is doing in my life. Because you come off a little crazy. People are going to discount it from the start. But you want to hear about things that are happening in your friends' lives. If you're a good friend. And so share your stories in relationship. Your story, nowadays, in our postmodern world, your story's credibility relates to the relationship somebody has with you. So the closer you are to somebody, the more important your story is. So share these stories with people you're close with. And if you don't have anyone, if you don't have non-Christians in your life to share these stories with, that's where you need to start. You need to go and get some. And chances are, your neighbors around you are not Christians. I think the last stat was maybe 30% of Calgarians would say they're Christians. So that means you got a 70% chance of meeting a non-Christian next door to you. And Bob taught us a few months ago how to meet your neighbors. He said, you see them outside, you walk up, hi, I'm Bob. You can use whatever name you want. That's how you meet your neighbors. It's just as simple as that. You go up and meet them. And people are actually generally a lot more friendly than we expect them to be. Lastly, use these stories to remind yourself of what God has done. The wonder of the gospel leaks. We forget so easily what God has done for us, the ways that God has worked in our lives. We just forget about it. But if we're telling these stories to other people, it'll remind ourselves, and that will strengthen our faith. That will actually allow us to take deeper steps to be even more involved in the work of God. Constantly through the Psalms, they're recounting the ways that the Lord has saved Israel. This is a great practice for us to incorporate into our self-care plans that Allison was talking about. In your own time with God, reflect. What are you doing for me? How can I share this with others?